The Transcontinental Railroad, a symbol of American ambition, a steel artery that promised to bind a divided nation together after the Civil War. When the first iron rails cut through the endless wilderness, newspapers called it the triumph of progress. But for the men and women who actually lived, bled, and often died along its path, it was something far more brutal. Imagine the year is 1865. The war is finally over, but the nation is still bleeding. A country wants connection, speed, and profit, and Congress demands a railroad that can stretch from Omaha to Sacramento, more than 1,900 miles through mountains, deserts, and untamed land. The reward: wealth and power. The cost: human life. If you tried to travel on it, if you dared to cross the American West during its construction, you wouldn't survive a week. The journey began in the East, where cities hummed with excitement about the promise of the railroad. But for ordinary travelers, there was nothing glamorous about it. Early trains were not comfortable carriages gliding across polished rails. They were smoky, rattling beasts that shook with every mile. Coal dust filled your lungs, sparks burned your clothes, and the noise was constant, a metallic heartbeat that never stopped. Even before the train moved, the stations were chaos. The smell of sweat, manure, and hot iron filled the air. Porters shouted. Conductors barked orders. People pushed and jostled for space. Tickets were expensive, and safety was a luxury you couldn't buy. Passengers sat on hard wooden benches for days, often sleeping upright, because there were no sleeping cars yet. Food was another ordeal. The railroads didn't offer dining services. If you were lucky, your train would stop at a small frontier town, and you could scramble off for a quick meal before the whistle blew again. Miss that whistle, and the train left without you, stranded in the middle of nowhere. And nowhere could kill you. The plains, wide and endless, looked beautiful from a distance. But step outside that train, and the world became merciless. No shade, no water, and the horizon burned with heat. In summer, the temperature could climb above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. In winter, blizzards swept across the prairie like ghosts, freezing travelers to death within minutes. Now imagine being one of the thousands of workers building that very railroad. These men didn't have the luxury of sitting inside. They lived in the dirt beside the tracks. They were mostly immigrants, Irish on the Union Pacific, Chinese on the Central Pacific, and both were treated as disposable. They worked 12 to 16 hours a day, swinging hammers, blasting tunnels, and laying down miles of steel under impossible conditions. If you think you could have survived that, think again. For the Irish laborers building west from Omaha, life was a constant battle against disease and violence. Cholera swept through the camps, killing men within hours. Mosquitoes carried fevers that burned through entire work crews. Food was scarce, mostly hardtack biscuits, salted pork, and black coffee. Water came from stagnant pools along the line, often shared with livestock. And if the disease didn't get you, the violence might. The railroad towns that sprang up along the route, places like Benton and Bear River City, were lawless dens of gambling, whiskey, and death. One historian called them hell on wheels. Gunfights were so common that some towns built makeshift jails out of railroad ties, knowing they'd need them before sundown. Workers got drunk, fought over wages, and sometimes murdered their own foreman. In one riot, a mob burned down the entire town, leaving the railroad to rebuild from ashes. Meanwhile, out west, the Chinese laborers on the Central Pacific faced a different kind of hell, one forged in rock and ice. The Sierra Nevada mountains stood like a wall between California and the rest of the continent. American engineers said it couldn't be crossed. But thousands of Chinese immigrants, paid barely $1 a day, proved them wrong. They drilled and blasted their way through granite cliffs using black powder and, later, nitroglycerin, a chemical so unstable it could explode if someone dropped it wrong. Workers hung from ropes over icy cliffs, hammering holes into the rock to set charges. Many never came back up. Snowstorms buried entire camps. Avalanches wiped out hundreds of men in minutes. In the harshest winters, the snow piled more than 40 feet deep. The survivors dug tunnels through the drifts just to reach their tents. At night, when the wind howled across the mountains, it wasn't uncommon for workers to vanish, their bodies never found until spring. The foremen rarely stopped the work. They simply hired more laborers. That was the reality behind the railroad. Not triumph, but endurance. Now, imagine you were a traveler crossing this newly built railroad once it opened in 1869. The Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit, Utah, marking the completion of the line. The telegraph flashed the message across the nation. Done. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and the nation declared itself united from sea to shining sea. But for those who actually stepped aboard to make the first cross-country journeys, the ordeal had only begun. A luxury ticket bought you a seat in a drafty wooden car, your clothes thick with soot by the first hour. The air reeked of oil, coal smoke, and human sweat. Sparks from the engine flew into open windows, burning holes in passengers' clothes. The constant clatter of the wheels made sleep impossible. If the train derailed, and many did, there were no rescue crews, no telephones, no doctors waiting ahead. You'd wait hours, maybe days, for another train to arrive. If the crash happened in the desert, you might never be found at all. And then there was fire. Steam locomotives ran on tinder, sparks, cinders, and dry wood everywhere. Entire trains burned to the ground when embers from the engine set the cars ablaze. Wooden carriages were death traps, and passengers often died not from burns, but from the smoke, choking as the fire devoured every breath. By the time the train crossed into the Rockies, travelers were often delirious from exhaustion. The mountains, breathtaking and vast, offered beauty and terror in equal measure. Landslides could sweep the tracks away. Tunnels collapsed. Water froze in the boilers. At high altitudes, oxygen was scarce, and passengers fainted without warning. Even those who made it across faced new dangers on the plains of Utah and Nevada. The railroad passed through territories still inhabited by native tribes, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, and others who had watched their land carved apart by steel. Raids on construction camps were common, and early passengers often traveled armed. To survive this journey, you needed more than courage. You needed luck. Because the truth is, the railroad didn't just connect the nation, it consumed it. It devoured forests for timber, rivers for water, and lives for labor. Every mile was paid for in sweat, blood, and human cost. And that's the cruel irony. What the railroad symbolized in American mythology, freedom, expansion, progress, was built upon unimaginable suffering. Even the workers who survived rarely lived long. The Irish crews who laid tracks across the plains were left jobless and forgotten. The Chinese laborers who conquered the mountains were denied citizenship and driven out of towns by racist mobs. When the railroad was finished, they were told they were no longer needed. That's the part of the story most Americans never hear. But the journey didn't end there. Because what came next, the rise of railroad empires, corporate greed, and corruption so deep it shook the foundations of the nation, would make the suffering of the workers seem like only the beginning. If you've made it this far through the story, you probably already sense it. History isn't just about dates and progress. It's about people, the forgotten ones, the ones who built a world that would never remember their names. So, before we go deeper into the true cost of the Transcontinental Railroad, into the men who ruled it, the corruption that consumed it, and the lives crushed beneath it, take a second. If stories like this matter to you, hit that subscribe button, because we're only halfway down the tracks. The railroad was finished, or at least, that's what the newspapers said. The golden spike at Promontory Summit had been driven into the polished track with theatrical glory, a symbol of unity and human triumph. Telegraphs flashed across the nation. Towns erupted with parades and fireworks. But beneath the cheering, something darker stirred. Because what the public didn't see, what no photograph or newspaper headline captured, was that the railroad's completion marked the beginning of an entirely new kind of suffering. It's easy to believe that the hardest part was the building, the tunnels, the dynamite, the starvation and disease. But once those rails began to stretch across the continent, the human cost didn't stop. It simply changed shape. The Transcontinental Railroad wasn't just a line of steel. It was a weapon, one that sliced through the American frontier, forever altering everything it touched. The land it crossed was not empty. It was alive, sacred, and inhabited. Plains, rivers, and mountain valleys had sustained native tribes for centuries. The railroad carved through their hunting grounds, polluted their water, and tore apart their sacred sites. It brought thousands of settlers westward, soldiers, merchants, farmers, and opportunists. And with them came barbed wire, guns, and disease. Every whistle that echoed across the prairie was a warning. The old world was ending. Entire nations, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, watched helplessly as the iron monster cut through their homeland. Buffalo herds, once numbering in the millions, were slaughtered en masse to feed the workers and to clear the way for trains. By 1880, the herds were nearly gone, a deliberate strategy to starve the tribes into submission. If you were a Native American living along the new railroad lines, survival meant running, hiding, or being forced onto reservations. The tracks didn't just bring settlers. They brought the U.S. Army, ready to crush any resistance. And if you were one of those settlers, the kind who packed everything you owned into a wagon and set out west to chase the dream of land and freedom, you soon learned that the railroad's promise came with a cruel price. Tickets westward were expensive. For most families, that meant selling everything they owned. They were told the journey would be safe, that the train would deliver them into prosperity. But safety was an illusion. Train cars derailed often. Explosions from faulty boilers were common. Coal dust hung in the air like poison, and ventilation was non-existent. Travelers coughed black soot for days. Infants suffocated, food spoiled, and the smell, unwashed bodies, tobacco, whiskey, and engine oil clung to the passengers for the entire trip. There were no restrooms, no comfort. Men used the platform between cars. Women endured as best they could. The trains rattled violently, shaking so hard that bones ached from the motion. And when the brakes screeched on a downhill grade, passengers clutched each other in fear, praying the cars wouldn't fly off the rails. Every stop was a gamble. The new railroad towns that sprang up along the line promised rest, food, and supplies. But they were also magnets for crime. Saloon keepers, thieves, and drifters followed the trains, knowing that every passenger carried something worth stealing. Gambling, drinking, and murder were so common that the railroad companies built their own private police forces to keep order or to silence witnesses. The deeper the railroad cut into the west, the more it devoured everything in its path. Forests were stripped bare for timber. Rivers were diverted for steam engines. And the workers, those who survived the building, became expendable labor for railroad barons who saw men as mere fuel. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific companies were supposed to symbolize progress, but what they truly built was empire. Every mile of track laid earned them government money, and the faster they built, the more they profited. That greed birthed one of the biggest scandals in American history, the Credit Mobilier affair. Behind the scenes, railroad executives and politicians colluded to inflate construction costs. They paid themselves millions in fraudulent contracts while underpaying the men who did the actual work. Senators, congressmen, Even the vice president were caught taking bribes and stock shares. The same Congress that celebrated the railroad's completion was already being corrupted by it. But the corruption didn't end in Washington. It seeped into every layer of the industry. Train fares were manipulated to exploit settlers. Freight companies fixed prices. And the companies owned entire towns, stores, saloons, even cemeteries. If you worked for the railroad, you often lived in a house owned by your employer, bought food from their store, and were paid in company-issued currency that was worthless anywhere else. You didn't live free. You lived trapped. The irony was brutal. The railroad that promised freedom westward had created a new kind of slavery. Even as passengers marveled at the speed of this new age, traveling 2,000 miles in just over a week instead of 6 months by wagon, the toll was measured not in time, but in lives. Train crashes became common headlines. Boiler explosions killed entire crews. Bridges collapsed under heavy loads. And when trains hit buffalo herds or snowdrifts, passengers froze or starved before help arrived. There was no emergency system, no reliable communication beyond the telegraph lines, which themselves were often destroyed by storms or sabotage. Many travelers carried pistols not for self-defense against bandits, but to end their own suffering if stranded in the wilderness. The psychological toll was immense. Diaries from early passengers describe nights spent listening to the creak of the train, the groaning metal, and the endless whistle that pierced the darkness. Some swore they heard screams echoing from the mountains where construction workers had died, their bodies buried beneath the tracks. It's easy to dismiss such stories as superstition, but the men who worked those lines believed the railroad was haunted. They said the mountains remembered, that the tunnels whispered in the wind, that every bridge trembled not from the trains, but from the ghosts beneath them. For travelers, that haunting wasn't just myth, it was experience. Every journey was a gamble with fate. When snow blocked the passes, trains were stranded for days. Passengers ran out of food, eating whatever they could, sometimes even boiling leather belts or chewing on candle wax to survive. When floods washed away bridges, they waited weeks for rescue. And still, they called it progress. Progress built on the backs of immigrants, the graves of laborers, and the blood of the land itself. But the truth of the Transcontinental Railroad was not just physical suffering, it was psychological conquest. The line between East and West wasn't just a geographic bridge, it was an instrument of domination. It erased borders, swallowed cultures, and rewrote history in steel. The railroad made millionaires out of a handful of men. Leland Stanford, Collis P. Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, the infamous Big Four. They became legends of American capitalism, but their empire was forged in human misery. They underpaid the Chinese laborers, denied them housing, and refused to acknowledge them in official photographs of the railroad's completion. In those famous images, men in suits shaking hands over the golden spike, the Chinese are invisible, even though they had built nearly 2/3 of the line. History erased them as efficiently as the camera did. And that's where the real cruelty lies. Not in the physical pain, not even in the deaths, but in the forgetting. The men who built the railroad were never meant to be remembered. They were tools, not heroes. The tracks became monuments to their suffering, but no monuments were built for them. By the 1870s, as the trains roared across the continent, the railroad's promise had curdled into fear. Farmers and settlers found themselves in debt to railroad monopolies. Native lands were gone. The wilderness was dying. And the same trains that once carried pioneers now carried soldiers, weapons, and corporate greed. If you tried to cross that country, you'd see the truth, not the glory written in textbooks, but the bones beneath the steel. And yet, there is still one more part of the story, the part that reveals how the railroad didn't just transform the land and the people, it transformed the nation's soul. The greed it unleashed would shape America's next century, and its echoes can still be felt today, every time a whistle cuts through the night air. Because the journey isn't over. The train keeps moving west. Its iron wheels grind over the bones of the past, echoing through canyons that once belonged to silence. To most passengers, the rhythmic clatter is progress, the sound of a new America being born. But if you listen closer, it's something else entirely. It's the heartbeat of a nation built on exhaustion, buried promises, and forgotten lives. The Transcontinental Railroad didn't end with the final spike. It only began there. For decades after 1869, the railroad became a living organism, expanding, consuming, devouring everything in its path. The vast wilderness that once seemed eternal was now sectioned, sold, and fenced. Each line of track carved through the land like a blade, slicing open territories and draining them of life. And behind every expansion was one unending truth: money. The railroad companies had become some of the most powerful corporations on earth. They owned not just trains, but towns, governments, even people. Farmers couldn't sell crops without paying freight rates so high they sometimes lost money on every shipment. Ranchers watched as railroads fenced off open ranges, forcing them to rent access to the very land their cattle once roamed freely upon. It was no longer a story of pioneers. It was a story of monopoly. The same rails that connected the country also divided it, creating two Americas, one of wealth and steel, the other of labor and hunger. The barons, Stanford, Huntington Crocker, built palaces on the profits of misery. Their names became institutions: Stanford University, Huntington Library, grand legacies masking the rot beneath. The men who once swung hammers under the sun had been replaced by machinery, but the suffering hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted. Railroad workers now faced 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, under impossible conditions. Trains thundered across rickety bridges, engines exploded without warning, and brakemen risked death every day coupling cars by hand. A job so dangerous it claimed more lives than battlefields. If you stood in a rail yard at night, you'd see men with missing fingers, crushed limbs, hollow eyes. They weren't soldiers, but their work was war. Accidents weren't accidents. They were the cost of doing business. The companies refused to install safety mechanisms because it wasn't profitable. Every death was written off as a statistic. Families received no compensation. Widows were told to move on. And still, the trains rolled on. You wouldn't survive here, not just because of the danger, but because of the system itself. The railroad owned the law. If you were injured, you couldn't sue. If you protested, you were blacklisted. If you organized, you disappeared. When the workers finally rose up in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, it was met with bullets. Federal troops opened fire on unarmed men and women, killing dozens. Entire towns were burned to the ground, and the newspapers called it restoring order. That was America's first national labor uprising, and the message was clear: the railroad was untouchable. But beneath that power, something was rotting. The very greed that built the empire began to consume it. Corruption spread through every rail company like rust. Lines expanded faster than they could be maintained. Track failures, bridge collapses, and derailments became common. Train wrecks were no longer rare tragedies. They were weekly events. Wooden cars splintered like coffins in motion. Lantern oil turning flames into infernos. Passengers trapped inside burned alive, while crews fought to pull them out. And when the smoke cleared, the railroad quietly paid off the newspapers to keep the headlines small. The public saw progress, but behind the scenes, the truth was horror. Even passengers who survived the journey west found themselves in a different kind of nightmare. The railroad promised freedom, but delivered exploitation. It lured settlers into lands that were barren, remote, and already scarred by industry. The glossy posters that hung in eastern cities showed fertile valleys and endless opportunity. What the settlers found were dust storms, failed crops, and railroad-owned towns where prices were rigged and debts never ended. The dream of the American West had been commodified. Every promise, every plot of land, every new beginning was just another product. And the greatest cost wasn't paid in money. It was paid in identity. The railroad reshaped time itself. Before the iron line stretched across the land, every town kept its own local time, sunrise and sunset, dictated by nature. But trains couldn't run on nature. They ran on precision. So the railroads divided the continent into time zones, forcing every clock in America to tick in sync with industry. From that day forward, time itself belonged to the railroad. The human body was forced to adapt to steel schedules. Life no longer followed the rhythm of the earth. It followed the timetable. Even now, more than a century later, every second of our lives runs on railroad time. That's the legacy few ever talk about. Not just the conquest of land, but of rhythm, of reality. But there was another cost, one that haunted the rails in ways no one could escape. Across the mountains of the Sierra Nevada, where the tunnels still echo, the spirits of the dead never rested. The Chinese workers who died by the hundreds were buried without names, their graves unmarked, their stories silenced. Some workers refused to return to the tunnels after dark, claiming to hear whispers beneath the rock, the voices of those sealed inside forever. Legends spread that on cold nights, when fog crawls through the ravines, you can still hear the hammering, steady, rhythmic, like ghosts still building the railroad they never finished. The people of the West came to call these sounds the echoes of labor. And perhaps they were right, because even after death, the work never truly ended. The tracks demanded maintenance, expansion, repair, a hunger that never stopped. Every year, more men died keeping the railroad alive than had perished building it. The railroad had become a living thing, a machine that fed on human effort and spit out progress. But progress for whom? By the end of the 19th century, the railroad barons controlled nearly every major shipping route in America. Their wealth rivaled nations. They dictated prices, influenced elections, and even decided where towns would rise or fall. If you wanted to live, work, or move, you needed their permission. And yet, for all their power, the system began to crack. Scandals erupted. Economies collapsed. In 1893, the overextension of railroads triggered one of the worst financial panics in U.S. history. Thousands of workers lost everything. Entire towns built around the promise of the railroad turned to ghost towns overnight. The iron veins of America were bleeding out. It was then that people finally began to see the railroad for what it truly was. Not a symbol of unity, but of control. The very machine that was supposed to connect the country had chained it instead. And while the golden age of rail travel would continue into the early 20th century, with luxury cars, dining coaches, and the illusion of romance, the ghosts of the first generation never left. Every gleaming passenger train that cut through the night was powered by the memory of those who built it, suffered for it, and died under it. If you rode one of those trains, you might lean your head against the window and feel the rhythm. The hum of metal on metal, a low, endless vibration. It feels almost alive. But that's not the sound of the engine. It's the heartbeat of everyone who came before. The laborers, the settlers, the lost. And maybe that's the most haunting truth of all. The Transcontinental Railroad didn't just reshape the nation's land. It reshaped its soul. It turned humanity into fuel, time into currency, and the wilderness into profit. It buried cultures, erased languages, and made ghosts out of the living. You wouldn't survive a journey on the Transcontinental Railroad, not because of the physical dangers, but because of what it demanded of the human spirit. It asked for everything, and in the end, it took it all. So when you hear that distant whistle tonight, echoing through the dark, Remember this, it's not just the sound of a train. It's the echo of every soul that once tried to cross the steel frontier and never came back.